In lesson 4, we're going to relax the assumption that prices are sticky in the short run by looking at macroeconomic unemployment using the neoclassical model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. You want to open up this desmos.com and you want to modify it for your numbers, right? The aggregate demand numbers for my model are 17.33 minus 0.39 y. My aggregate supply curve is upward sloping now. I'm going to copy these numbers into here, replacing the 10.42 plus 0 with 1 plus 0.78 y. And then my potential GDP is 15.06. Since aggregate demand is downward sloping and aggregate supply is upward sloping, in the short run, real GDP is determined by the intersection of those two. And GDP here is only $13.957 trillion in my model. The price level is 11.89. I give that to you, right? 11.89, rounded 2 decimal places. GDP should be 15.06. This is the potential GDP level. But GDP in the short run, in this case, is only 13.957. So the output gap is a negative 1.103. I'm going to go ahead and press enter to find out if we got them right. Cool. Now, the fiscal budget was assumed to start out as balanced. So taxes minus government spending, that's 0. And I'm going to go ahead and say, suppose taxes are 5 trillion, then government spending would have to be 5 trillion, and the deficit would be 0, right? The fiscal budget balance would be 0. Now, in this situation, let's blow it up a little bit. Again, GDP is less than what it should be, right? It should be 15.06, but it's only 13.957. That means unemployment is greater than the natural rate of unemployment. And the natural unemployment rate is the desired amount of unemployment because it includes the people who have moved for a better quality of life. And once they find work after they start looking for work, they're going to be more productive. Or it includes the people whose jobs were kind of mundane and repetitive. Those jobs were replaced by a robot. That replacement doesn't cause GDP to fall. It probably actually causes GDP to rise because we don't need a person anymore doing the job that a robot is doing, right? So what does that person do now that they've lost their job? Well, then go back and get more training. And maybe they can train in a field that firms are having a hard time finding people to work. So once they get the training and they get that job, that firm's productivity just went up. Their output just went up. So that contributes to GDP. Those are good sources of unemployment. The bad source of unemployment is cyclical. And when unemployment is greater than the natural rate, that means cyclical unemployment is positive. And that's a bad thing, right? That means we're in a recession, right? Now, to push the economy back to full employment, senators and representatives compromise on a 2-part fiscal stimulus. In stage 1, Congress passes, whenever it's looking at government expenditure, it's looking to increase it, right? So it passes an increase in government expenditure that we've assumed is $0.646 trillion. And we're going to assume that it has an effect on the macroeconomy, which shifts aggregate demand outward and upward, right? So I'm going to copy this curve. I'm not going to copy the PLAD. I'm just going to copy the equal sign to the Y, right? And I'm going to place it right below my potential GDP. I'm going to call it P again, right? Now notice it's red. That's good, right? So this red line is that red line. And notice what happened to GDP. GDP is now higher, but also look what happened to price level. The price level increased along the short and aggregate supply curve because this model relaxes the assumption that prices are sticky in the short run. So we have an increase in GDP And we have an increase in the price level. GDP increases from 13.957 to 15.509. The price level increases from 11.887 to 12.317, right? That's going to come up later. Let's check our answers to make sure that they're correct so far. And they are. So the new GDP level, like I said, is $14.509 trillion. The price level is 12.32 to 2 decimal places, right? The output gap is smaller. GDP is supposed to be equal to 15.06, but it's only equal to 14.509. So let's calculate the output gap here. 14.509. And GDP should be, if we were fully employed at full employment, 15.06. So the output gap is still present, but it's smaller, negative 0.551. And we'll see if we got those answers right. And we did. Now, in order to get aggregate demand to move from black to red, again, we had to increase government spending by 0.646, right? So if we go back to here, if our government spending was 5 and our taxes were 5 and the fiscal budget was balanced, if we increase government spending by 0.646, it will increase to 5.646, right? That's what it was. That's what it is, right? So our deficit is now 6.46, the amount of the increase in government expenditure. Now, the unemployment rate, because there's still an output gap, the unemployment rate fell. The cyclical unemployment fell, but cyclical unemployment is not 0. So the unemployment rate is still greater than the natural rate. We're going to calculate the government spending multiplier now. So here is the increase in government spending. GDP increased from what it was at 13.957 to what it is now at 14.509. So this is what GDP was, and this is what GDP is, right? Let's just double check. GDP was 13.957, right? GDP is 14.509. The increase in GDP is just 0.552. The government spending multiplier is the increase in GDP that can be attributed to the increase in government spending, right? So this is what GDP increased by, and this is what caused that increase, an increase in government spending. So the government spending multiplier in the neoclassical model is a lot smaller than it was in the Keynesian model, right? So here, the government spending multiplier is only 0.85. And that implies that each $1 increase in government expenditures caused real GDP to only go up by $0.85. Much smaller effect in the neoclassical model than in the Keynesian model, right? Now we're going to calculate the increase in GDP. Remember, we said GDP increased, right? And we also said price level increased, right? We're going to calculate the percent changes, right? This is the increase in GDP, right? From 13.957 to 14.509, right? So I'm going to copy this. We're going to divide that by what GDP was. GDP was 13.957. The percent increase in GDP is 3.95, but to 1 decimal, this 5 makes that a 0, and that makes that a 4. So it increased by 4.0%. Oh, this should have been unemployment, right? Unemployment. Sorry about that. Let me check that again. Okay, so real GDP increased by 4.0%. What about the price level? Remember, we said it increased, right? Because short and aggregate supply is upward sloping. So the original price level was 11.887. So the original price level was 11.887, right? The new price level is 12.317. So 12.317, right? So this is what the price level is after the increase in government spending. This is what the price level was before the increase in government spending. So the inflation rate is 3.6%. 3.6%. Okay, so unemployment wasn't lower to the natural rate yet, right? The gap had not been closed yet. So in stage two of this compromise, Congress cuts taxes by 1.057 trillion. And that results in this blue aggregate demand curve, right? So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to create a new blue demand curve right below the red one. So P equal to that. I'm going to change the color to blue to match my open math. Okay, so notice now when I zoom in here, the increase in government spending moved us from this point up to this point on the red aggregate demand curve. The tax cut moves us from this point up to this point with the blue aggregate demand curve. So the combined effect of the two fiscal policies is to push aggregate demand to the point where it intersects both short aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply at the same point. All three curves intersect at this one point. At the new equilibrium, real GDP is now $15.06 trillion, which is equal to potential GDP. Right? Remember, potential GDP was 15.06. Now GDP is 15.06. The price level is 12.75, right? To two decimal places, 12.75. It was, after the increase in government spending, the price level is 12.32. Now the price level is 12.75, right? Real GDP has been increased to equal potential GDP. So the output gap is zero. Now, what about the fiscal budget deficit? Well, remember initially tax revenues were 5 trillion. We just made it up, right? And government spending was 5 trillion. But then we increased government spending by 0.646. Here we've cut taxes by 1.057. So what we're going to do is we're going to lower taxes by 1.057. So we have lower tax revenues, greater expenditures, and the fiscal deficit is 1.703. Okay, now the unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate. We've eliminated cyclical unemployment. So the unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate, which is the sum of structural and frictional unemployment, which is a healthy, productive source of unemployment. Let's close this out here, kind of clean this up. Okay, so now we have to calculate the tax cut multiplier, right? The increase in GDP that results from the cut in taxes, GDP ended up being 15.06. Before the tax cut, GDP was 14.509. GDP was 14.509. GDP now is 15.06, right? So this is the increase in GDP, right? We're going to divide that by the amount of the tax cut. The tax cut was 1.057. So the ratio of the increase in GDP that can be attributed to the tax cut divided by the tax cut is the tax cut multiplier. The tax cut was a decrease in taxes, so we're going to change this change in taxes to negative. So the tax cut multiplier is a negative 0.52. And it implies that each $1 reduction, hence the negative, right, in taxes caused real GDP to increase by just $0.52. Okay, so the last thing we have to do is calculate the GDP, the percent change in GDP and the percent change in the price level, right, that is associated with the tax cut. So we're going from the red demand curve up the short aggregate supply curve to the blue aggregate demand curve on the short aggregate supply curve, right? And remember what we said, GDP increased from 14.509 to 15.06, right? That was the increase in GDP attributed to the tax cut. To calculate the economic growth rate, we take what GDP is after the tax cut minus what GDP was before the tax cut divided by what it was before the tax cut. And we multiply that by 100. And we get a GDP growth rate of 3.8%. And again, GDP increased, right? Now, what about the inflation, right? The inflation. The price level after the tax cut is 12.75. And we can see that here, right? 12.75, 2 decimal places. What was it? It was 12.32. So that's the increase in the price level. We want the percent increase in the price level. And the percent increase in the price level is what the price level is after the tax cut minus what the price level was before the tax cut divided by what the price level was before the tax cut. And that results in an inflation rate of 3.5%. So the price level increases by 3.5%. So in the neoclassical model, there is a cost to doing fiscal policy to stimulate us out of a recession and push unemployment down.